glad that they do. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Hebrews again. I know it's been a little bit, what's the right word, methodical as we deal through this. A lot of this, and even today and next week and the week after at least, is a lot of Jewish history. And you're all going to go, oh boy, what does that mean for us? Well, there's a lot of applications, but Hebrews, the book of Hebrews by name, is written to Jewish Christians. So this is very pertinent to the context of the book. However, I think there's great application. If we don't study some history, we get a little bit in trouble, even today. If we don't know our history, we're kind of doomed to repeat it, as they say. So we have to have some history here. So as the writer, whoever that is, to the book of Hebrews, he's coming from that Jewish historical point. Now these first century Jewish Christians were struggling with their belief. Okay? Why do I want to change what I came from, Judaism, go to Christianity? And so the writer is giving, if you look at it individually, but if you look at it corporately, he's giving a huge logical argument for this. Now we've looked at a lot of this, and there's still a lot to come, but what's our key word? If everybody can remember this.
Better.
It's better. And last week in chapter 8, we had that verse 6 says, "But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry," speaking of Jesus Christ, our high priest, by how much also he is a mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. So what is taking place in this Jewish setting is he's gone back to Jewish history, and he's talked about Moses, and we've already talked about Moses, and Abraham, and the covenants, the conditional, the unconditional covenants, and they all served a purpose, okay? And it's all, at least when I read through it, I said, man, this all makes real good sense to me. The dilemma I have is what makes sense up here doesn't always come out here, see what I'm saying? So I'm trying to get this all together because it has great foundational theological truth. In Hebrews, Jesus Christ is described as our high priest, okay? But there was a dilemma to that. You remember what it was? According to the Old Testament Mosaic law, who could be a priest? Only Levites. Aaron, especially. But Jesus Christ was not a Levite. He is of the tribe of Judah. So there was a dilemma. So what was the situation? How was that? And we might be tenants to think that, well, God just came up with this idea just so this would fit, right? There's only one problem with that, is God had this plan long before the Levitical priesthood came into existence. It wasn't like, oh, I need to make an adjustment. God already had this in place. Jesus Christ, after the order of Melchizedek, became our high priest. For how long? Forever. And that's a critical point because he's comparing the Old Testament Levitical priesthood with that New Testament covenant, Jesus Christ as our high priest. So we're going to continue on. Chapter 9. And chapter 9 is really no break in thought, except he's going to introduce for us, and I'll read it. "Then verily," verse 1, "the first covenant also had ordinances of divine service." Those words right there mean worship. Had orders for worship and a worldly sanctuary. And here it is, "For there was a tabernacle made the first." What does the word tabernacle mean? Dwelling place. It's a tent, it's portable, but it's where somebody lives. That's the definition. In fact, John chapter 1 verse 14 says, the Word became flesh and tabernacle. Dwelt among us, right with us. Not separate, but right with us. So we have what is instituted here, a tabernacle. So let's jog your memory and let's think a little bit. And I know I played this game with my wife, and she doesn't quite think like I do either. But if you were to describe the book of Genesis, how would you describe it? I'll give you a hint. In the beginning. It's the book of beginnings. Okay? We have creation, the beginnings of everything. And as you go through, I was going to say transgress, wrong word, but as you go through the book of Genesis, we have, creation, and then we have the fall. Then right after the fall, we have what? Okay, but even before the patriarchs, we have judgment, the flood. God judges. We don't often associate the Noahic flood, or however, was in Genesis chapter 6. That's pretty early in the whole scheme of things. God said, the wickedness of man is so great, I cannot deal with it, I'm going to wipe them out. And he has the flood. So we have creation, sin, fall, judgment. And then, as Ruth said, we have the patriarchs. And who are the patriarchs? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, the three patriarchs. And basically, from Genesis 11, he's mentioned Abram, but in chapter 12, he becomes the sole, and his family, the sole topic. Okay? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then one of Jacob's 12 sons, Joseph, becomes real prominent. Geographically, where are they? Patriarchs. Israel, the promised land. God told Abraham, get up and go, and I'll show you. And they've settled in the promised land. Huge point. When Genesis ends, where are they? Egypt. In Egypt. Why? Huge famine. Who's in charge in Egypt? Joseph. Okay, he's second underneath Pharaoh. And there's been a great famine. You read the last few chapters of Genesis, you see where they move en masse. Jacob, still alive, brings his whole group, and they move down to Egypt to be under Joseph's care. Okay? This is a huge point. I'll get to the huge point. This is trivial. How many people were there, made their way to Egypt? 70, yeah. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. 70 souls went with Jacob and made it to Egypt. How long were they there?
130 years.
Exodus chapter 12, where you're going to be today. And I know we've talked about that. I'm not going to step on your sermon. But Exodus 12, 430 years. What happened during those intervening years?
They became slaves.
They were slaves, but they also populated, multiplied, huge. How many? We don't know. And there's a lot of but hundreds of thousands. And through the 10 plagues, they move out of Egypt, cross the Red Sea, into the Promised Land. Okay? Or not into the wilderness, but here. How did Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, how did they worship God? Okay? Where did they worship God? There's multiple references in Genesis where Abraham built an altar. Bethel. Other places. He built an altar. Moriah, and he worshiped. There was no central place where they worshiped. There was also, when Abraham worshipped and Isaac and Jacob, they worshiped either individually or with their families. This nation was coming, but when they leave Egypt, now they are a nation of several 100,000. How are they going to worship? So what does God institute? A tabernacle, which means what? The dwelling place. The tabernacle is hugely important, and I'll be honest, I've kind of overlooked this in my studies before, but the tabernacle is hugely important because it gives to us, by God, through Moses, it gives to us a very specific way on how we are to worship. Now, I'm going to make some applications. Some of those things have changed, and we've seen that. Did we still have sacrificial offerings? No. Why? Because Jesus was the last sacrifice. Okay? And we'll see that. Last part of chapter 9 is going to deal with that. But the temple became, or not the temple, the tabernacle became the first form of corporate worship, where people came together collectively to worship God. There's several things that are intriguing about it, and John and I thought he's going to talk about the temple and preach about the temple, or tabernacle, but not today, and next Sunday is Mother's Day, and he said, I don't know, but he's headed that way. He just doesn't know exactly when, so I'm not. But this was the first institution of corporate worship, where God says, this is how you're supposed to worship me. There's one thing that I have to bring out. It has to be reiterated. God says the temple, by definition, is this is where I am. And you come to me in worship. They actually, that Jewish people, that generation, had a visible representation of God. You know what that was? That cloud by day and that fire by night. And it's interesting, as I read through those passages in Exodus, when the cloud would descend upon on that tabernacle, and Moses says, as Moses walked through the camp, every man came to the door of his tent and watched to see if the cloud was there. And Moses would make his way through the camp to the tabernacle and meet with God. And when those people could see that visibly, they said, God is in the tabernacle. He's there. And Moses is going to go literally talk to God. A profound effect upon the people. It says they would stay in their tent and they would worship. There was and I'm not saying anything brand new. When Moses was 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, and the cloud was on the mountain, and there was thunderings, and the people were terrified. And yet Moses, he's the one that goes up there, and it said he talked with God as face to face. He intervened for the people. Just imagine what that was like for a minute. For Moses to go and do that. But the people there was an element of fear when it came to worshiping God. And that was part of that old covenant. Remember what the old covenant, if you basically, Mosaic covenant, and you sum it up simply, remember what it says? If you obey me, I'll bless you. If you disobey me, I'm going to punish you. That's what it says. And we can see ultimately through the course of the Old Testament, the people failed. Last week, in the end of not Exodus, but Hebrews 8, the writer talks about this new covenant. I will put my law and my word in their mind and in their hearts. Okay? That new covenant fulfills that. The old covenant points us to the new covenant. But chapter 9, we're going to talk about the tabernacle. And it's important. Because it teaches us how to worship. Now, we don't worship exactly the same way. Let me just... How important is worship? No, the short version. I mean, it's essential. God has not rescinded this commandment to worship. Now, here's the dilemma. Where can you worship God? Everywhere, wherever you are, at any time. And people will give us, I've had that, I don't need to go to church to worship God. True statement? Yeah, absolutely. They usually throw that out there as an excuse, right? And I can tell you firsthand experience, I've had some great worship on top of mountains. And I'm not ashamed of that. But God said, this is how you're to worship me corporately as a nation, and that plays over into the New Testament, which we're going to see, and I'll just give it to you ahead of time, in Hebrews chapter 10. He's not talking about tabernacle anymore. He says in Hebrews 10, not forsaking the assembling ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as we see the day approaching. Interestingly enough, in the Old Testament, God said, this is my tabernacle. And he told Moses, this is how you build it exactly. In the New Testament, when Jesus talks to, in discussion with the disciples in Matthew chapter 16, and he asks the disciples, who am I? And Peter says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus goes on and says, this is my church. Upon this rock I will build my church. There's great parallel there. Whose church is it? Whose tabernacle was it? Where the church, and I'm be a little careful. Well, I can throw that out. I can say without doubt, the New Testament church is the place where we gather together for corporate worship. The tabernacle, and then the temple, Old Testament, but the New Testament church is the place of corporate worship. Now you can worship out on the mountains, out wherever you want, but I believe New Testament clearly teaches we have, what's the word? Duty, obligation, whatever, to worship corporately. And there's a lot of variation there, but I think that's valuable. Second point, when we talk about the fire and the cloud, what is, that's called the Shekinah glory, right? God's presence. I never considered this too much. I mean, a lot of these things kind of bounce around, but don't. When did the Shekinah glory leave the temple? Ezekiel describes it. And what was the event, historical event preceding that? The captivity. Right before the destruction. Nebuchadnezzar from Daniel destroys it. Read Ezekiel's chapters 8 through 11, where it says, in vision, Ezekiel said, I saw the glory, the Shekinah, in the holiest of holies, and it ascended, it usually said on the mercy seat. It ascended to the ceiling. Then it went out of the Holy of Holies, and it ascended to the roof, and it stayed there, and then it departed. And I think, John, when you first came back in January, you talked about it's departed, and those high priests that would come in after that, who said they were in the presence of God, and they would make atonement on Yom Kippur. But the presence of God wasn't there. It was gone. So in effect, they were going through the motions. Has the glory returned? What's John chapter 1, verse 14 say? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled, and we beheld His glory. The glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. When, I'll answer my question, has the glory returned? Absolutely. In the presence of Jesus Christ, He was the glory. He was the fulfillment. He said, where when the Old Testament Israelites saw that cloud, they said, God is with us. God is here in the camp. The tragedy of the New Testament, even John chapter 1, he came into his own, and his own received him not. When Jesus, who was the physical Shekinah, can I say, the glory of God, when he was present on the earth, the people, I was going to say ignored him, but that's not the right word. The people rejected it. And it was there in full force. Here's the glory of God. And they rejected it. Is the glory still here? Who's the tabernacle today? Who's the temple today? We are. We have, as Christians, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit residing. He, same word, dwells within us. It's the exact same word as tabernacle. He dwells within us. We have become, and I'm careful here, but maybe I can say we have become the possessors of the glory of God because He indwells us. We become, as someone said to me not too long ago, we become the physical representation of Jesus Christ upon earth. We become the only Bible some people ever look at. That's a huge responsibility. Just as God gave Moses, and we're going to look at some of these articles here, or furnishings, and I'm not going to get into them in great detail. But, well, Exodus chapter 25, and I have to read a couple verses. You get the tabernacle from about Exodus 25 through Exodus 40. Pretty detailed. Lots of chapters. Then you get the high priest and his responsibilities and how he's to wear it. And the Lord said unto Moses, this is Exodus 25 verse 1, spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they bring me an offering of every man that giveth it willingly with his heart, he shall take my offering. And this is the offering which you take of them: gold, silver, brass, blue and purple, scarlet, fine linen, and goat's hair, and ram skins dyed red, and badger skins, and shittim wood, and oil for light, spices for anointing oil, and for sweet incense, onyx stones, stones to be set in the ephod and in the breastplate. And let them, verse 8, let them make me a sanctuary, that I may tabernacle, that I may dwell among them. We have a distorted view of God sometimes as this high being who sits up there, who is not, he's aloof, right? But it was God's desire to be right amongst His people, in and amongst the people, open and available for everyone. It's just not for specific people available to worship God. He said, I'm going to be right in their midst. And you can read all the way through there, and it's pretty, well, at least for me, it was pretty engaging reading this. I read through those chapters. It was pretty amazing. So the tabernacle is important. Go back to Hebrews chapter 2 if you're not there. A worldly sanctuary where we are to worship. Verse 2. For there was a tabernacle, the first, wherein was the candlestick. So you want to play a trivial game? Were there real candles back in those days?
Lamps,
They were lamps. And how were they lighted?
oil.
With oil, with olive oil. Maybe a little bit of a poor translation. It should be a lampstand. Instead of, because when we, I mean, and it's described as the menorah. You know what the menorah is? How many lights in a menorah? 7. And you put the candle, but this is not, we have, It probably looks similar to that, but you didn't stick candles in it. They didn't have candles. They filled them full of oil and a wick, and they lit it. And the priest was to fill them full of oil every morning, every night. They never went out and trimmed the wicks. Provided light for the tabernacle. And the table and the showbread. How many loaves of bread? 12, it said in the Old Testament. How many tribes? One for every tribe. How long did they stay? 7 days. And then the priests ate them, and then a new batch was baked or cooked, or however they did it, and brought in 12 tribes, representing 12 loaves, representing the 12 tribes. I'm tongue-tied. And after the second veil, what's a veil? It's a big curtain. It's a big covering. It's a cloth door. Okay, the veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all. Okay, I don't know. Are you going to have pictures when you? He's going to have a PowerPoint, so I won't get ahead of it. But there was 2 chambers. Okay, or there's an outer courtyard which the people were allowed to come into. And then there was the holy place, which only the priests were allowed into. And then there was the holiest of holies. Okay? I did learn some things. Have you ever heard that they said, in the Old Testament, they would tie a rope to the high priest when he went in on Yom Kippur? In case he died, they could pull him out. You ever heard that? Is it biblical? Nope. Total fabrication. Where it came up with, I looked it up. Google never lies, you know. I looked it up and they said, who knows? Total fabrication. How about the bells on the bottom of the high priest's garment?
They were pomegranates.
Okay, but that was actual. Why did he have those? They could hear him. However, if you go back to Exodus, 28 or somewhere there, it talks about, God gives detailed instructions to Aaron. He did not even wear the high priestly garments into the holiest of holies on Yom Kippur. He didn't do it. He had to wash himself ceremonially clean and put on a clean new linen garment only. And then service in the holiest of holies. He didn't even have on, and I didn't know that. So I'm learning things too, which is always good. But that's interesting. We get some strange ideas that don't necessarily have, don't have any scriptural backing. We got to be careful. Okay? Verse 4, they had the golden censer, which is incense. They burned incense. And the Ark of the Covenant, overlaid round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant, or what? 10 Commandments. I don't know if you've ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. This is what they were looking for in that movie. Is the Ark still in existence?
Yes.
I think probably. I think the Jewish priests, when the Romans, contemporary when Hebrews was written, when the Romans were coming into Jerusalem in AD 70, I believe those high priests, that priest probably took the ark and hid it. That's just me. And there's all kinds of theories. You can read about those if you want. But the Ark of the Covenant. Okay? Go to verse 5. So you have the picture. It's overlaid with gold. And it's a box. In the box are what's described there? A pot, which is an earthen jar filled with manna, Aaron's rod, and the tables of the covenant. And then on top of that, the lid is formed the cherubims. And it's hard. I don't think anybody has a complete understanding of what a cherubim looks like, because you can get lots of different pictures or ideas. But the cherubims, who are angelic beings of glory, shadowing the mercy seat, which we cannot speak of particularly. Even the writer here doesn't know exactly what they look like.
You sure they don't look like little chubby little Valentine thing with a little bow and arrow?
Right. Exactly. Yep. And on that's a valid point, because even when you go to the book of Revelation, it says, and I saw the 4 beasts, right? Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 5. In a better translation, I mean, when we think of a beast, what do you think of? A monster, something hideous, something scary. And I don't believe those in Revelation 4 are hideous beasts. They're living creatures. They are the cherubims or the seraphims. And it's every time they're mentioned in the book of Revelation, what do?
Worship God.
They worship God. They usually begin the worship that everybody else falls into. And it's symbolic here. These are the cherubims who hold a position, I don't know how they got there, but hold a position of influence and power. And they're on the mercy seat. Okay? Now when these things were thus ordained, or built and set apart, sanctified for this service, the priest went always in first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God. How to worship. And I asked the question last week. Do we have priests today?
Yes.
Who are we? We are the priests. I answered my own question. Who are we? We're the priests. We do not need a priest to intercede for us to worship God. Why? When Jesus Christ was crucified, when he died, the moment, you read this in the Gospels, when he died, when he said, "It is finished," what happened in the temple? The veil was completely torn in two. The veil that separated the holiest of holies, where the ark was, where the presence of God dwelt, was ripped in two and exposing or opening that to everyone. So we do not need a priesthood. And I'll pick a little bit, we do not need to confess our sins to any human person in order for the abolition of sins, right? We go directly to God. We are individual priests. We're indwelt. Verse 7, but the second room, holiest of holies, the high priest alone, once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. Think about the position of the high priest. And I looked this up, and I could not get a definitive answer. So sometimes Google leaves you hanging. But was there ever a high priest who was killed in the holiest of holies? If he was not pure by that ceremonial washing, wearing the right garment, taking first an offering for himself, and he had to do that first, and then an offering for the people. There's no reference in the Old Testament where there ever was a high priest who was killed because he went in there impure. But think about how big a deal that is. You get to stand before God representing the whole people. I mean, you better make sure your ducks are in a row, right? What did he take for an offering? Blood. Blood of what? He took the blood of a bull. He took a bull or livestock, and then he took 2 goats, right? The blood of the bull was for himself. The blood of one of the goats was for the people. What happened to the other goat? The scapegoat, which signifies what? He would lay both his hands on the head of the scapegoat, which means what? transferring the sin of the people. What did they do with that goat? Let him wander around in the midst of them? They drove it out into the wilderness, which symbolizes what? Get the sin out of here. Get it out of here. Drive it far away from you. Okay? For the errors of the people. Interesting word. What's the errors mean? Errors of the people. Sins. What kind of sins?
The New King James says that offered for himself and the people's sins committed in ignorance.
Ignorance. Okay? And that's as I studied it, that's what they said too. So here's the distinction. If you, as an Old Testament Israelite, knew that you had committed a sin, what was your immediate responsibility? Take your offering, go to the temple or tabernacle here, and offer that sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. Right? That's what you were required to do. Sins of ignorance. What does that mean? You didn't even know it. Trespassing, where you maybe it's a beat or too much, but it covers all the sins. And that's a hugely important point, because how much of the sins did Jesus' blood cover? All of them. Can't escape that. Verse 8. Let me keep going. The Holy Ghost thus signified that the way unto the holiest of all was not yet made manifest or clear, while the first tabernacle was yet standing, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make that service perfect as pertaining to conscience. The Old Testament law, the Old Testament worship, I don't know if it's the right word either, was tedious maybe? I mean, when you had to go to the tabernacle, you had to find a priest, you had to go to the temple, and you had to do all these things. And it was necessary. It was God's law. God established it. And there's one thing that came to my mind over and over was, thank God we don't have to do that anymore. Now, I'm going to, not to say that sin isn't serious and we should not deal with it, just like the scapegoat and the blood offering. Sin is serious and we need to deal with it, but we don't have to go through that tedious procedure. The other thing that's interesting about that, it was a very public procedure. So is there some remorse involved? Think about that for a second. How about, I mean, you might be able to do something that nobody knows about, but yet you know that it has to be dealt with, and you have to go to the temple or the tabernacle with your offering. And are there not people watching, seeing what's going on? Would that be a little bit humiliating? Maybe all part of the process. Which stood only in meats and drinks and divers washings and carnal or physical ordinances imposed upon them until the time of the Reformation. And I never even remembered that that word was even in there. Reformation. What is Reformation? The completion, the change. All this points to verse 11. But Christ being come a high priest of good things. This whole Old Testament system, which we really don't understand, we really don't appreciate, to be honest, all came to fulfillment and conclusion in Jesus Christ, which hopefully we understand and we appreciate. The good things to come, and by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building. Jesus Christ fulfilled one of the biggest obstacles that he had in his earthly ministry, especially with the Jewish people, was what? You're destroying our whole way of life, our whole belief system. And in Matthew chapter 15, Jesus says, I'm not come to destroy the law or the prophets, I'm come to fulfill, complete them. The other dilemma, and I think it's applicable for us too, you can see it played out in the Old Testament. We talked a little bit about it last week. The Old Testament Jewish person could become very religious, very obedient even. It says in Isaiah, quoted by Jesus in Matthew again, with their mouth and their lips they worship me, but their heart is from me. The Old Testament Jew could become very religious, but completely lost. So how does that apply? And I'll just... Does church become a duty? Is it something that we just... I'll say it because today was a hectic morning at our house, okay? Sunday mornings, I thought, boy, it'd be nice to just stay home. That was the thought I had. Okay? Be a whole lot simpler, right? And I thought, okay, why am I going to church? Well, it's the right thing to do. Right answer? Yes and no. Not a complete answer, but yeah, it is the right thing to do. But if, hopefully, there's much more to it. We can become, just like that Old Testament Jew, very religious. Meaning, oh, I'm doing all the right things, and miss the whole point. And what's the whole point? We often say, Christianity isn't a religion, it's more about a relationship. And I kind of like some of those cliches, but I think we can become very religious and miss Jesus Christ, who is the fulfillment of the old covenant and the personification of the new covenant. How often did Jesus Christ go into the holiest of holies? Once. And he offered himself once. And you're going to see this through the end of chapter 9 and into chapter 10, over and over. He went in there once. Offered himself once. And it paid in full. I have lots of favorite songs, but one of the top ones is Jesus paid it all. His blood paid it all. As that high priest, sacrificial Lamb of God. So don't get so, and I'll quit, don't get so full of, and I know it's a lot of history, and I think it's interesting and it's very applicable, but don't miss the main point. Who did Jesus Christ die for? For me. Don't miss that. God tells us how to worship. And he's going to give us more details. And John will fill in some of my blanks. But worship is important, and it starts with the right relationship with Jesus Christ. Who is he? He's not just some figure of history. He's God's perfect atonement. The sacrifice for sins. And until we know, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, but they need preached to as well, don't forget that. It should be the basis of everything that we believe, and that should portray in how we live. Where does God live today? We're the temple of Jesus Christ. He gave complete, detailed instructions, and he told Moses, don't deviate from this. This is how you're to build it. This is how you're to worship. And a lot of those things still apply today. How do we worship God? Spirit and in truth. That's how we worship. Jesus Christ indwells us. Are we good ambassadors for Jesus? You can think about that, and I'll quit. It's time. So I better close. Let's close in prayer. We'll be dismissed. Father, we're thankful.